The Trade Federation is actually way worse than many realize, and we may actually be able to call it Palpatine's greatest weapon in his early years in his Sith career. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. One of Darth Sidious's first big plans when it came to the consolidation of power was using the Trade Federation to cause massive problems on his home planet in order to gain a sympathy vote, a vote that would place him in the office of the Supreme Chancellor. But Sidious wouldn't have thought to use the Trade Federation to do such a cruel act if it wasn't innately in their nature. If a perfectly legitimate business suddenly decided to cause a planetary crisis, it would raise a lot of suspicions. But the Trade Federation was anything but legitimate. Greed was a given, but their corruption and power ran far deeper than anyone could control. Viceroy Nute Gunray was only one man. Arresting him meant little when the evil Trade Federation was an entire entity, one which was the catalyst for the creation of the Clone Wars. So join us as we open a holocron and talk about the evil of the Trade Federation, Palpatine's greatest weapon before the Death Star. First though, we wanted to talk about what exactly the Trade Federation is, and how they used to operate before they became so corrupt. They weren't always an evil business bent on galactic market domination. There was only a very few differences in their origins between Legends and canon, so we'll mention both continuities here. We begin in the Golden Age of the Republic, which would have been around 350 BBY. The requirement for such a federation to exist can be traced back to the Republic's efforts to encourage economic development in the outlying star systems. By creating free trade zones encompassing those entire systems, the government effectively helped increase the flow of travelers and merchandise there. Free trade zones were simply areas in the mid and the outer rim where trade could be conducted without any sort of government taxation. The idea was proposed to help end the stagnation and isolation of the outer rim territories, those that were isolated following the Ruusan reformation in 1000 BBY. Ever since the end of the new Sith Wars, a lot of shipments of supplies to the outer rim of the war ceased entirely. This created a difficult life for the citizens living deeper in space. As a result, piracy and crime ran rampant. At the time, the outer rim territories of the galaxy were a mostly lawless frontier, outside of the general jurisdiction of the Republic, of course. In EU, the Trade Federation was created as a Republic-chartered branch in order to mediate disputes between the galaxy's merchants and shipping companies. At the time, transportation megacorporations were stifling commerce, but shutting out competitors from the outer rim spaceports, refusing to share any navigational data with them. The Trade Federation helped curb such abuses of power so that a fair trade market could flourish in the unknown territories. In canon, with the creation of the free trade zones, the new wealth attracted pirates and plunderers of all kinds who preyed on the vulnerable trade caravans beyond the protection of the Republic. Consequently, a number of major commercial shipping and manufacturing corporations united together to ensure their own protection, forming the Trade Federation. The initial organization was meant to combat pirates, mediate disputes between its internal factions, and even promote their own interests before the Republic Senate. It was a very powerful branch, and it was so for about 100 years. But after this century, the Trade Federation had become a single entity, consolidating all of its internal companies into one giant conglomerate, and they were now a shipping cartel superpower. At the time, it was controlled by a directorate, which was led by a commanding viceroy. At first, the Trade Federation was composed mostly of a myriad of species, including the Neimoidians. The Neimoidians, who were known for their business skills and cutthroat dealings. Their species had a mind for commerce and finance, and they weighed every decision and interaction as if it were a big-time deal. It wouldn't be long until the Neimoidians were the ones in control. In the beginning, the Trade Federation was a model business that used their power to benefit trade companies and residents in the Outer Rim. The commerce guilds increasingly worked together to negotiate more favorable rates and policies, and soon even began to build their own fleet of starships. But this is where we get into the Lucrehulk cargo freighters, that would later become known as the command ships. By 250 BBY, the Trade Federation had advanced beyond its original mission. They had now become one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy, and were lobbying to advance trade interests in the Galactic Senate. This also worked to open up new regions of the galaxy to trade and commerce, with the Trade Explorer Corps blazing numerous new routes into the Outer Rim territories, and establishing networks of retail outlets, depots, way stations, landing fields, in thousands of isolated systems. This connected to the Republic to new planets, offering a new economy to help impoverished worlds. Soon though, the Trade Federation found itself having to defend its transports from piracy. The Republic was going to be no help, since they refused to organize a proper military, and the planetary security forces were either too corrupt or ineffectual to help. So the Trade Federation established its own trade defense force, comprised of, you guessed it, battle droids. They were able to accomplish creating their own private military force, complete with battleships and starfighters, by using a legal loophole and calling it security. This was the beginning of the end. The very beginning of the Clone Wars, with the Namordians' considerable resources, including a far-reaching access of hyperspace networks, as well as a solid reputation as galactic traders. The Federation became one of the wealthiest corporate organizations in the entire galaxy, and began controlling a large portion of interstellar shipping passing through the Outer Rim territories. With the rapid expansion in the Outer Rim, they stifled competition and enforced deals with their powerful trade defense force. It soon dominated hundreds of star systems, but this was only on the front lines. They too had gained new power, influence on Coruscant and the Senate. By this point, the Federation had maps of hyperspace routes, those that they still refused to share, enabling them to cement their hold over trade routes. Only the Jedi and the Office of the Supreme Chancellor were able to maintain maps of similar quality. As their power continued to grow though, the Trade Federation started dominating galactic trade and ruthlessly suppressing opposition. By 124 BBY, trade between the core and the Rim was once again dying out. In an effort to jumpstart commerce, the Galactic Senate declared that the Outer Rim was a free trade zone, but this merely exempted the Trade Federation from local taxation. It moved aggressively into the new free trade zone, crafting arrangements with impoverished sectors, worlds that the Federation could now control. What this meant is they essentially handed over Senate votes. Other sectors were forced to give up their economic self-sufficiency, becoming perpetual customers of the Trade Federation. What resulted was a massive number of Republic representatives in their back pocket to use for proposing and voting on legislation in the Senate. Legislation that only benefited the Federation only. They controlled enough Senate votes to hamper competitors, influence the courts, and to stall legislation. These terrible deals they forged with the Outer Rim territories also effectively gave them control over their world's own political structures, and even allowed them to legally blockade the planet if they felt so inclined. In 67 BBY, it even gained a seat in the Senate, despite not being a planet. To make matters even worse, the Federation gained full voting privileges as a part of a deal secretly negotiated by Higo Damask, Darth Plagueis. Although in order to do this, they had to relinquish some of their monopoly on the free trade zones, something the Namordians were very disgruntled about. Galactic industrial conglomerates such as the Federation became responsible for an economic upswing for senators, lobbyists, and entrepreneurs on Coruscant who placed themselves in the service of such massive organizations and groups. In a sense, the Trade Federation was responsible for a majority of the corruption in the Senate that we hear so much about. By 33 BBY, the Republic Senate had grown very troubled by the monopoly that the corporation had on the Outer Rim, and they met on Iriadu in order to discuss a taxation of free trade routes. However, as organized by Sidious, a radical terrorist group arrived and tried to assassinate everyone present at the meeting. However, they failed to kill the Supreme Chancellor Valorum, but they did kill every member of the Directorate. This left a power vacuum to be filled by the slimy and ambitious Nute Gunray. Soon after this, almost every member of the 7-person Directorate had been inexplicitly murdered, leaving Viceroy Gunray as the last and the most powerful leader of the Trade Federation. It wasn't long before Darth Sidious approached Gunray to use the Federation for his own plans. He had engineered Nute's rise to power himself, knowing that he would be easy to manipulate. The Dark Lord of the Sith promised power and money in return for accepting his orders alone, and the greedy Gunray accepted. He convinced them to lobby in the Senate for less restrictions on them, creating more weapons for their droid army, citing piracy. This also allowed them to create even more battle droids, along with ground assault crafts, heavy artillery, all done in absolute secret away from the Republic. The Federation was building an army. But there were still those that opposed. Valorum decided that he could do was only to stifle the progress of the Federation, passing a Senate law which enabled taxation of the free trade zones yet again. To protest this though, and to push through its own proposed legislation, the Federation blockaded Naboo with its fleet, and invaded the planet with its droid army. All of this was done under the instruction of Sidious, who wanted to push Queen Amidala into placing a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, and then get himself elected as a sympathy vote. At the time, he and Gunray wanted to force the Queen to sign a treaty that would effectively give Naboo over to the company as an entire asset. Palpatine of course cared not for what happened to his homeworld, as if Naboo were under the control of the Federation, then it would be under his control as well. He could influence everything that was going to happen on the world, but he really didn't care. But of course, even though it failed, the invasion of Naboo would cause a chain reaction of events that would lead to the Clone Wars. The fact that the blockade happened at all revealed the weak and corrupt nature of the Republic government, spurring on several Rim worlds' desire to secede. This gave rise to Dooku, who fell from the Jedi Order after Qui-Gon Jinn's death, on a mission that the Republic should have taken care of rather than a Jedi. Nute Gunray, although he was arrested, continued to pull the strings of the Federation from the shadows, all the while supplying the Separatist movement with money, supplies, and battle droids. All the while, Sidious was cackling from the Chancellor's chair. All in all, the Trade Federation began as a legitimate business operation, one that positively impacted the lives of billions in the Outer Rim. But by the end of it, they had become so greedy and corporate that they caused many more deaths, and became the catalyst to the rise of the Dark Lord of the Sith. One of his greatest weapons, in fact. The Trade Federation, when we peek behind the scenes, really allowed the Sith to rise in this era in the galaxy. By gaining control of them, this was the very first step that the Sith would take to finally claiming the entirety of the galaxy. It's a brilliant political move that was only allowed because of the Jedi and the Republic, and how they had grown to believe that they were the ultimate force in the galaxy, the perfect breeding ground for the Sith Empire. So tell us, my friends, what do you think about all of this? What are your thoughts about the Trade Federation? And if not, was this something that you had wanted to know about before? And were you aware about just how impactful the Trade Federation actually was in securing Palpatine's seat of power? As always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting the channel and the archives today. Force crush that subscribe button for more lore, and have a great one.